1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, my name is Dajana Turkovic. I'm a workforce development analyst at the City of Kingston, and I'm here to tell you more about the Workplace Inclusion Charter.
Welcome to Tell Me More, the podcast that knows that include is a verb. Sometime in late 2021, a new theme began popping up in opinion columns as some pundits declared no one wants to work anymore in response to post-pandemic restriction labor shortages. Were they right, though? Certainly, since the first set of restrictions eased during COVID, there's been a documented and persistent labor shortage across Canada. While it's impacted different fields in different degrees, it is there. So, is it because nobody wants to work anymore? Or is the truth a little bit more complex? And maybe the more pressing question for many is, what do we do about it? Today, Dajana Turkovic, a workforce development analyst at the City, joins us to talk about how the City is utilizing a commitment to inclusion to help us, our community, and our neighbors attract and retain talent. Welcome, Dajana. Great to have you here. I'm sure you saw some of the articles I'm talking about. Personally, I thought it was a bit of a simplistic take. Maybe you could start by helping me understand how we got here, what's led to the current labor shortage.
Thank you for having me. I see where people are coming from. A lot of employers found that when they posted jobs in 2021, they weren't getting the uptake they were used to getting. So the first reaction is no one wants to work. But the data doesn't support that interpretation. Our current labor participation rate is at its highest measured level. So we have more people in the labor force than we've ever had. The participation rate of women is especially high right now, and our unemployment rate hovers at about 5%, which is very, very tight for a labor market. So when it's around sort of the 4.5% mark, you have everyone who should be in the labor force in the labor force.
Right. So all indicators are pointing towards we've got a lot of people working, actually.
We do. People are working. Wages are going up. So overall, the economy is healthy. If you're trying to recruit, however, it can be very, very challenging. Now, the pandemic exacerbated the labor shortage due primarily to an increase in retirements of workers in the age group of 55 to 64, because that wasn't necessarily as anticipated,
right.
And also to changing job preferences. This whole theme of labor shortages, it was a problem before COVID. As early as 2016, restaurants were struggling to find cooks. The skilled trades were experiencing mass retirements. The long-term care homes were operating without adequate staffing. And you would hear that, but it was contained to these sectors. And so overall, people didn't feel like it was a crunch. They felt like it was someone else's problem.
Right.
And then the convergence of the pandemic, retirements sort of creates this perfect storm that pushes us into a historic labor shortage, which is what we're in now, when we thought we maybe still had some time to figure it out and to adjust. And this is especially noticeable in the service sector, the healthcare sector, the construction sector, and education.
Right.
So I'm just going to use healthcare as an example because we have so many healthcare workers in Kingston and we have such a developed healthcare sector.
It's very prominent.
It's very prominent. Yeah. So if you look at sort of what the COVID-19 pandemic did in healthcare is it put such a strain on the system, leading to an increased demand for staff. So you're looking at medical professionals, at nurses, doctors, support staff, lab technologists. In most instances, that meant that people had to work more hours because you couldn't necessarily just make more people to go into these jobs. The people who were there already had to work a lot of overtime.
And they're skilled jobs that take a lot of specialized skill sets to get into.
Absolutely. And the government tried to sort of ameliorate the situation a little bit. They provided free training for personal support workers that we have a massive shortage of as well. But that wasn't enough to really take all the pressure off. So you had some people delay their retirements. Through COVID, you had some people return from retirements to work during this COVID wave. But then what happened is that, people worked for 2 years. They worked insane hours. They put in their time, and then the ones who were due to retire, retired.
Right.
And the ones who had already previously retired and unretired, retired again. And some people were just so burned out, they left the profession. And so we're seeing that now becoming a bigger problem. So they've done some surveys with practical nurses, and about 50% of them are considering leaving the profession because they're so stressed. We're seeing it with registered nurses, with more of them applying to go work in the States where the wages are higher and the stress is lower because they get to work at sort of low impact clinics and private clinics and things like that.
And the skills are in demand everywhere.
The skills are in demand everywhere, right? And so the U.S. is making it easier for them to change those to attain those requirements and get their license. So we're seeing all of this, and we need to do something about it, but everything takes time to do. So we're in this, the government is trying to implement different initiatives. We're seeing it with the College of Nurses, working harder to integrate internationally educated nurses into the workforce, but all of that takes time. So you're seeing that in healthcare, which is sort of a big sector for us, but you see it, in construction, you're seeing it with the retirements of the skilled trades. People are leaving the workforce. We want to build all these houses. We welcomed 1 million people to Canada.
Yeah.
The population grew by 1 million.
Yeah.
It's almost exclusively immigration.
Right.
Where are the people going to live unless you can build houses? And if you don't have people in construction building houses, then everything becomes a non-starter, right?
It sounds like it's compounding a pre-existing
It just
problem.
compounds it. So, and again, governments try to address it, but it takes time.
Right.
And I think without COVID, all of this would have happened, but it probably would have happened at a slower pace, and it would have been more incremental. COVID kind of pushed it into the forefront.
So rather than having like a handful of problems spread over 5-10 years, we had them all kind of arrive at the same time, and right on the heels of, when everybody's feeling their best, right after the worst of a pandemic's hit, right?
Bingo. And if you look at the service sector, which is kind of the ones that tends to complain quite a lot about these labor shortages, people's job preferences change. So if you think about COVID and the lockdowns and the restrictions, the service sector locked down most often.
Yeah.
So, and because these tend to be lower wage, lower security jobs, people after maybe the first or second lockdown thought, I need to make a change.
Yeah.
So they took on jobs that weren't as vulnerable to lockdowns, and also weren't as vulnerable to exposure. A lot of people had fears around COVID and catching COVID. And they didn't want to be around large groups of people, understandably so. So people moved. So if you look at some data around, young people, specifically sort of ages 18 to 24, who tend to be highly represented in the service sector, a lot of them moved into IT. They started working, call centers, like Amazon call centers. You can work from anywhere. Regular hours, benefits, things like that. And you can work from home. So I understand where people are coming from, but the data just doesn't support the nobody wants to work. Everybody actually does want to work, and they're already working.
I was going to say, it sounds like people are trying really hard to work, and in some cases working quite a bit. It's just there's been a lot of shifting. There's been people leaving the workforce, people coming in, shifting to other jobs, and a lot of movement is what it sounds like.
A lot of movement. And I think, too, because the pandemic was such a once-in-a-generation experience, people sort of reconsidered what they wanted to do with their lives, right?
Makes sense.
And a lot of people with not having a job and being on CERB, perhaps had some time to consider educational options and do some remote, classes and improve their skill sets. And it really helped to raise wages. Like, wages have gone up considerably for people. And that's a really good development. But again, in the lower paying sectors, it's a challenge, and they have to adapt.
Yeah. I guess then if you've got these employers who were working one way before the pandemic, and then you have this big break, and then they try to kind of return to business as usual afterwards, but everything has changed. It takes a while to catch up and
It absolutely does.
understand the layout.
And one of the things that's changed too is that we no longer have the liquor service sub-minimum wage. So that changed last January.
Okay.
And it was an attempt by the government to get people to return into the service sector, right? Because again, now you could make better wages being a restaurant server if you were getting paid minimum wage plus tips versus sub-minimum wage plus tips. So there are efforts being made, but inflation isn't helping either. As people just keep seeking higher wages, and the job hopping has kind of slowed down now. But at one point, if you change jobs, you were looking at, a 10% increase in salary.
Right.
So again, with inflation going up, you were probably getting a 2%, 3% raise at your job, but inflation was 11%. So you were actually making less in real money than you had made before. But if you found a different job, you would be making up that difference.
Interesting. Okay. A lot of moving pieces then.
Workforce is a fascinating subject.
Yes, I'm not at all surprised to find out the situation is more complicated than initially.
I have a lot more data on them if you want.
Oh, that's good. I'm gonna swing this over to the workplace inclusion charter now. So at the time the pandemic had started, we'd already actually begun this project, right? We had some groundwork laid on that.
Oh yeah. So the work on the workplace inclusion charter really started in the spring of 2017. So now, was it 6 years ago? When the city endorsed the workforce development and immigration strategy. So it was the first of its kind for the City of Kingston. It really focused on employment in the community.
Okay.
And
so not just at the city, but broadly within Kingston all around?
Correct. So it was looking at all our different sectors and how we, as a smaller city that tends to be fairly homogenous, and on the older side of the spectrum, how do we attract, retain workers, and what can we do to do that better? So it was a process that lasted about 16 months. The city had hired a consultant. He's a local consultant who does wonderful work, and he spent 16 months talking to people, doing focus groups, doing extensive research, and he presented a strategy, which is it's a longish document. It's about 130 pages. Yeah. And he made several recommendations based on the data he had collected. And so one of these recommendations had to do with the implementation of more inclusive strategies in the workplace. So the Office of Strategy, Innovation, and Partnership, which is where I work now, was established to deliver the strategy. Oh, okay. Yeah, so it started off as a small team of about 3 people, right, and has now grown to a quite a large team. But that was the impetus for that. So they have, there's a strategy, there's now a person that's attached to the strategy, a workforce development analyst. And they started looking at the best way to deliver these recommendations, and they decided to go with working groups. So 7 working groups were established, tapping people who had experience in a particular field. So for the workplace inclusion charter, for this inclusive workplaces working group, the focus was on getting people who had experience working with newcomers, who had experiences working with, different systematically excluded populations. Mm-hmm. And so this working group came together and sat down and started thinking of different ways we can really support employers in having more inclusive workplaces. Right. And so they came upon an example from Bow Valley, Alberta. It's a small, very touristy place that gets a lot of newcomers to work there during tourist seasons. So I think there are a couple of tourist seasons they have, and they would get a lot of folks. And so they wanted to work with employers to help them support their newcomer employees so that people would stick around. And so we looked at this charter and had some really good recommendations. And so we put a Kingston spin on it and applied for grant funding and were successful. And so we launched it as basically a way to support employers as they move towards inclusion in the workplace. So what makes the charter unique is that it focuses on small and medium businesses, which very often lack internal resources to really address EDI needs. Right, yeah. And so it puts them in a really precarious position because a lot of them are mom and pop shops. They've had the same group of folks working for them for a longer period of time. They're now nearing retirement. It's an established workplace culture, but you need to bring in new people. Yeah. So how do you make those changes? And where do you even begin? Yeah. And so the charter was designed to address that. This whole entire charter strategy was designed to address that. And since the workplace inclusion charter is funded by grants, it's free. So we were able to really sit down and think about how do we make this as accessible as possible for employers. We were really fortunate to have Keys Employment and Newcomer Services on board because they're so used to working with both newcomers and employers and job seekers. So it's a perfect fit. And they've been delivering the project for the last, now it's been 3.5 years. Oh, wow. Okay. But the city continues to support through grant funding. So that's where the money flows from.
Okay, yeah. That's incredibly interesting. Taking a program that worked in another community in another part of the country and repurposing it for Kingston's needs. I like that. So what's the value then of these inclusion efforts for employers? Are we seeing, does it help to bring on new employees or retain them? Did Bow Valley have any kind of results that we could look at? Or
Bow Valley is so small, they didn't really do much tracking at the time. For them, the focus was really primarily on ensuring that employers understood the settlement needs of newcomers.
Okay, yeah.
So for Kingston, when we first started, the funding was focused on newcomers and refugees. And so that was sort of our first, I call it the pilot phase of the project. That sort of ran from August 2019 until sort of February of 2020. By that time, we had applied for a larger chunk of funding from Future Skills Center that would allow us to expand it. So the data that we used as we were sort of pitching the charter project and as we were working on grant applications was collected over a period of 10 years by different large institutions, like the McKinsey Institute was one of them. Harvard had done quite a bit of research. Even the Conference Board of Canada had some research on the impact of EDI, specifically on recruitment and retention. And so there are numerous studies that speak to the effectiveness of inclusion efforts when it comes to attracting job seekers. So the one that that's sort of pertinent to Canada is by the Conference Board that found that 71% of job seekers consider diversity and inclusion important when deciding which companies to apply to. And 80% of employees were more likely to stay with an organization that is diverse and inclusive.
wow.
Yeah, so those numbers are quite significant, right? The other sort of big impact that perhaps gets lost a little bit is that when you're successful at EDI and you attract a diverse workforce, then you also improve your overall innovation, problem solving, reach of your markets.
New voices,
new ideas, new backgrounds. Right. And that's something that really benefits the bottom line of a business, right? Because you're now reaching a larger customer market. The other piece too is that people are becoming more aware of where they're shopping. So if you're really authentic and genuine about your EDI, it attracts more customers. Right. People like to see themselves reflected in the companies they support.
Look at the values as well as the products. Right?
Exactly. And there's a big movement towards sort of like social consciousness when you're shopping and the awareness of what the company is doing. And customers, whether rightly or wrongly, tend to assume that if you're serious about EDI, you're sort of checking the boxes on the other social initiatives as well, things like environmentalism and, paying your workers a fair wage and things like that.
Right.
So all of that stuff, there's a lot of research backing this.
Interesting. Okay. So on that note, I know the City of Kingston has been working within our own organization to address inclusion. I assume for many of the same reasons, actually. But how has this impacted our workforce?
It's a really good question. So the council endorsed the Workplace Inclusion Charter back in 2019 when we sort of officially launched it. And it was really at the forefront of EDI initiatives for municipalities of our size in our region. Toronto has done work, Brampton has done work, but those are very different demographics than we are. So this commitment from council to really embrace EDI eventually led to the creation of the EDI office.
Okay.
And so that's kind of what's been spearheading a lot of the exciting initiatives, such as the training for staff and council, changes to committee recruitments, and the creation of employee resource groups. And the positive response we've seen from staff to these initiatives, and also from the leadership, you're seeing it in the conversations that are taking place, not just with the EDI team, but also through things like City 360,
right?
Which we are on, Paul and I, and which is really looking at, how do you create this workplace that is inclusive of everyone?
Right.
And, how do you build this workplace culture that really conveys that?
Well, it makes sense, too, that we should kind of get our own house in order before we start, exporting that to others.
And that was a really big thing for when the charter launched. It was really important that City Council endorse it. And it was really important that the city genuinely engages with it, which it has done.
Yeah. I think there's an intrinsic value to supporting diverse and inclusive workplaces. I personally prefer to work in those environments. But I guess I want to know if purely on a hiring and retention level, if we've seen an improvement or if we could or would even measure that.
I think at this stage it's probably too early to say whether retention levels at the city have improved. You have to take the pandemic into consideration, and there's all of these other sort of things that are happening external to just EDI. Mm-hmm. it takes time
Yeah,
for change to take effect. But that being said, there's a lot of research saying that authentic EDI is crucial to employee retention because it creates a more welcoming and supportive workplace culture. So this, that sense of belonging that people get when they work at a place that feels welcoming to them, that they feel like they can really be themselves in and like they contribute and their contributions are valued, that really contributes to retention.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense. People would want to go to a workplace where they feel like their contributions are valued. And yes, you do it for the paycheck and the benefits, but also you want to feel like you do something of value during the day, right? You spend so much time at work.
And you're so right, we spend so much time at work. And for businesses, when you're really investing into your employees and you're really investing into creating a welcoming workplace, that reduces your turnover. And turnover is really expensive.
It is.
The sort of higher an employee sits in the hierarchy, the more expensive it is to replace them.
It also makes sense.
So being able to retain is a very effective business strategy in itself.
Yeah.
The other piece is too that people really want to work for organizations that stand for something. And prioritizing EDI initiatives shows that you value and respect your employees, you value and respect your customers, you're open to other cultures, and those are all important sort of values for a company to stand for.
Good signals too for clients and consumers.
Yeah.
All right. So with this project, with the Workplace Inclusion Charter, we've sort of entered a new phase. We're now kind of, in a sense, exporting diversity and inclusion initiatives to neighboring municipalities. Could you tell me a bit about the current phase and how the regional EDI expansion of this project has gone? How many neighbors are we working with?
Yeah, so we've been now on this project for about three and a half years. And as I mentioned, when the charter was initially created, it was intended as a support for small and medium businesses that lacked the resources to develop their own EDI initiatives. And part of the reason we were able to do it is because we got grant funding, so it was free, it didn't cost anything, and that is very appealing when you have a very tight budget. What we discovered, though, is that our assumption that large businesses knew what they were doing when it came to EDI was not accurate. And there was a lot of outreach to the team at Keys from large organizations looking for EDI support. Among them was the City of Kingston. It was one of the first really large employers to reach out and, by endorsing the charter, started doing the work. And they found that, an organization the size of the city with numerous departments that include unionized and non-unionized staff, and that also delivers essential services to the community, presented a whole new challenge. Because now the tools and the resources you need are so much faster and more diverse and more complex. And so one of the key conclusions that came through this work with the city was that we needed an internal EDI department to maintain the momentum that was started with the charter, but also to develop additional EDI resources and initiatives for the city. And so we also found that the municipalities around us were facing very similar issues, except with even fewer resources than we had. So then we found that if we're struggling with EDI, they're probably also struggling with EDI. And so we made a pitch to Future Skills Center, which is our funder, to basically say that we would expand the Inclusion Charter project as delivered by Keys. We would improve upon the city's own EDI initiatives, and then we would take all of that and share it with 3 to 5 neighboring municipalities.
Okay.
And so right now we're working with 3.
Right.
We're hoping to include 2 more as the project progresses, but it's hard to tell how long it's going to take with the implementation within a municipality, because even though this project is free, it does require the employer to do the work.
Yeah.
So we're now working with 3 and we're seeing how that goes.
Interesting. Okay. And so on a sort of tangible level, how are we helping them with their own inclusion efforts? What does that look like?
Yeah, so each municipality will work with a team that consists of an inclusion advisor, 2 inclusion coaches. They're employed by Keys, and they've done this before, as well as the city's EDI project analyst.
Okay.
So the team the charter team, in collaboration with the municipality, will complete a needs assessment, develop an action plan, and guide the implementation. The municipality will then also receive coaching and mentoring from the city CDI team. So Samyukta and Mohammed will sit down and chat with them, share firsthand experiences about things that worked, things that didn't, successes, lessons, stuff that's really unique to the municipal setting.
Right.
In addition, so once they've sort of started the work with the municipality, the charter team will also work with one local business in each community. They will sit down with them and guide them through the workplace inclusion charter process. The goal is for this project that by the time we've worked with the municipality and we've worked with one business, they can serve as the champions of inclusion in their community, and they can sort of guide it moving forward and really embed it even more deeply within a community. Yeah. And sort of in the long term for sustainability, Keys is currently working on establishing a community of practice. And so that's going to include all of the local businesses that have already participated in the charter project, which is about 50, plus the municipalities, plus their local businesses, so that hopefully we will have this large regional community of practice where people can go for resources, ideas, support to really drive this work forward.
This whole thing is like a snowball.
It is.
A little bit, it just gets bigger and bigger and runs under its own momentum.
That's the idea. And it's, there are a lot of resources out there that really focus on bigger communities, and there isn't as much for smaller communities. So I think by having these little communities of practice that really focus on local and regional issues, it's helpful.
Oh, for sure. And it's important. I mean, local communities need this kind of support as well. And if we've had the opportunity to sort of fine tune and develop some methods that might work for them, like why not, right? So we're a fairly homogenous city, as you've mentioned, but we are sort of increasingly diverse with each census that comes out. And one of the things that I do think attracts people here are the opportunities to study at Queen's or St. Lawrence College. So I'm wondering if efforts like the Workplace Inclusion Charter help to convince folks that come here to study to stay here and form community.
I really hope so.
Okay, good.
That's why we do it.
We'll check back in a couple of years and see if there's been any success on that.
I think there's, I think it demonstrates that there's a commitment within our community to make a change. We want to do the work,
right?
To become more inclusive, to become more welcoming, and I think folks pick up on that. I moved to Kingston 10 years ago, and it was way more homogenous than it is now. You see a lot more diversity. And I think by, ensuring that employers have the skill sets and the tools they need to accommodate newcomers, whether they are, from other parts of Canada or other parts of the world, really helps that, because people stay where they have a job that they like and that sustains them.
I feel good.
And the charter was really inspired by that. It was inspired by the need to create these more inclusive workplaces in the community. So although I'm here talking about this project and living my dream of being on a podcast, I really hope I've been able to convey that the Workplace Inclusion Charter is the work of many, many different people and organizations who brought their passion, dedication to every aspect of it. And I really want to highlight the inclusion team at Keys that has been delivering and fine-tuning this program for the past 3 years, the grant development team at the city that has successfully secured over $1 million of funding for this initiative and continues to keep everything on track, making sure we fill out our activity reports and all of that fun stuff. And, last but not least, the employers who chose to participate in this project and, do the hard work that needs to be done to make their workplaces more inclusive. This has been an incredibly exciting and rewarding initiative for me to work on, and I'm really excited to see where it takes us as a city, but also as a region.
Sounds like a community working together to improve the community.
I know. It's a good news story.
Very sweet. Thank you for joining us. This has been great.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, folks, that's it for us today. Thank you for listening. You're why we're here. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider rating us or subscribing. Ratings help us to reach a wider audience, while following or subscribing means you won't miss new episodes. As always, if you have an episode topic you'd like us to tell you more about, please let us know. We're always happy to receive mail. Send us a note by emailing podcasts@cityofkingston.ca. Until next time, stay well.